So I've touched on how we can develop individual elements of the knowledge base. And I would just like to point out that reflection is not enough. We can't develop subject matter knowledge and pedagogical content knowledge through reflection, as pointed out by Richards and Farrell in this quotation. So how then can we develop a knowledge base? And in my book, I propose that generally speaking, EAP practitioners can essentially access knowledge and develop their knowledge in three ways: first-hand, second-hand, and third-hand access. So what I call third-hand access is by learning from teaching materials that were developed by others. And it can be in-house institutional materials, it can be published textbooks, it can be student-facing materials that are freely available online. And I think this is a very common entry to the profession because there's so much you need to learn when you start teaching EAP that you just don't have time. So I think it's very common to just look, oh, I need to teach this. How do others teach it? I'm going to have a look. Okay, I'm going to use that or adapt it or use something similar. So I understand why there are reasons for accessing knowledge through this third-hand access, but it leads to de-skilling of practitioners because we are relying on the knowledge of others. And teaching materials as such do not show us what knowledge was used to inform the materials. So we might be perpetuating misconceptions about academic writing and EAP more generally. So I would advise against developing knowledge in this way. So a better way is a second-hand access, and this can include attending presentations at events, at conferences, and reading publications which do not necessarily present original research findings or an original theory, but they show us how we can apply someone else's theory and research findings in our teaching. So here we're moving on from learning from student-facing materials to learning from scholarly outputs for EAP practitioners. And in this way, we can develop broad knowledge. And of course, it takes more time than third-hand access. And I am aware that people also need to have access because publications can be behind paywalls, etc. So there's issues around access, precarity, workload. But in terms of developing our knowledge, this is a preferable way. And hopefully the second-hand access is a gateway for the first-hand access, which is reading original research findings and theoretical frameworks. Now, of course, that takes a lot of time, but we develop deep knowledge. But we can't develop deep knowledge across the whole EAP. So we would develop deep knowledge through first-hand access in specific areas that we're interested in and rely on second-hand access for the broad knowledge. Okay, so now I'm moving on to misconceptions. And I've put them under several areas. And the first one is what I've decided to call skills. So the first one is that argument has two sides, for and against. I became aware of this a few years ago when I was working on a scholarship project with my colleague Jodie Bradford, in which we were looking at how argument is constructed across disciplines. And what we heard from some colleagues was, what are you looking at? Argument has two sides, for and against. So that made me realize that from perhaps some EAP practitioners, this is how they understand what argument is. But this is a very reductive viewpoint. And I've got a quote here from Vitae. Vitae proposes a framework of skills and knowledge that researchers across disciplines need to develop. An argument is one of them. And Vitae define argument as, quote, a series of claims from which new knowledge, meanings, and contexts can be inferred by applying reason, end of quotation. And as a researcher, you would be expected to do more than just evaluate two sides. You would be expected to explain, predict, draw implications, suggest a proposition, answer a research question. So in that understanding of argument, it's much more complex, much broader. And then we know that we can apply argument to other genres and to all disciplines. A second misconception is arguable, and that is criticality is a transferable skill. I'm saying arguable because in the literature there is disagreement as to whether it is or it's not a transferable skill. However, I think it is not a transferable skill because evidence suggests that when we teach criticality as embedded in a discipline, that's more effective than teaching criticality as a one-size-fits-all approach. And when we teach it as embedded within a discipline, transfer is more likely within the same discipline than across disciplines. So I would argue it's not a transferable skill. Another misconception is teaching genres is prescriptive. So some people say, well, if we teach genres to students, we're limiting their creativity. They're not able to express themselves the way they want to. But again, this is a misconception. And Hyland points out that there is nothing inherently prescriptive in genre pedagogy. And he says that when we learn genre conventions, quote, this does not dictate the way we write. It enables us to make choices and facilitates expression, end of quote. So instead of seeing genre pedagogy as giving students some kind of template, I like to see genre pedagogy as giving students a toolbox. And from that toolbox, it's up to them to choose which tools they're going to use, and they need to be able to make those informed choices. So for example, if I'm teaching the method section, some students might want to talk about participants, other students might want to talk about the equipment they use because their research varies. So again, there's nothing inherently prescriptive in genre pedagogy, and we should not make it prescriptive. And the last one is that paraphrasing is a skill that can be practiced in a decontextualized way. So I recently saw a blog post for EAP practitioners that suggested that we use paraphrasing as a warm-up activity. So essentially that every class starts with, here's a sentence, paraphrase it. And that might be useful in thinking, okay, they're going to have a lot of practice in paraphrasing, but I think there's many issues with that. So first of all, we are focusing on paraphrasing sentences, not ideas. And the research by Howard et al. 2010 showed that this is a common problem for students, that they paraphrase sentences instead of ideas. So they focus on the form rather than the content. So I tell my students that they need to paraphrase ideas, not sentences. Also, if we're practicing paraphrasing in a decontextualized way, we're stripping it of any purpose. So we're making it look like to students that it's just a language exercise for the purposes of avoiding plagiarism. But that's not the case, because when we're using ideas of others, we need to have a purpose for using those ideas. And if we take that away, we're forgetting that if we were citing the same ideas for different purposes, then we would probably also paraphrase the same idea in different ways. And finally, paraphrasing in a decontextualized way, or practicing paraphrasing in a decontextualized way, also introduces some, or has a danger of introducing some shifts in style and in coherence, which leads me to the next misconception. And here I've got just one. And that is coherence equals cohesion. And I've seen it in teacher materials when coherence and cohesion were understood as the same thing. And a long time ago, Carol, in her 82 paper, she titled the paper Cohesion is Not Coherence. More than 40 years later, I can still see many people just making them the same thing. So I'll come back to this later, but for now, for me, the difference is that one is about information structure and the other one is about language devices linking information. Okay, moving on to the third area, misconceptions around lexis and grammar. A very common one among students is that passive is a type of tense. So if I show them a sentence like this, the webinar was organized by Bali TED in EAP SIG, and I ask them, what tense is this? They will typically answer passive. And it's true that this is passive, but it's voice. So I'm asking about tense, which is past simple tense. So I see this very commonly in students, but I have also seen it in teacher materials. So if the question was what tense is it is, then the expected answer actually was passive, but that's conflating two things. So again, it's something we need to be able to separate so that we can support students adequately. And this leads me to the next one, which is quite controversial perhaps, that EAP should not teach grammar. And I've heard arguments like, well, EAP is not about grammar and students have had enough grammar already, and that's all fine. And I'm not saying that EAP should heavily focus on teaching grammar, but I think we shouldn't ignore grammar either, because academic writing is a specific register with complex grammar. So we don't need to teach general English grammar, we need to teach academic grammar. My third point here is overemphasis on nominalization. So nominalization is nouns which are derived from verbs or from adjectives and typically express processes. So for example, removal instead of remove. And academic writing contains a lot of words that are like this, that are nominalizations. And I once heard someone say that she was told that EAP was all about nominalizations. She herself disagreed with that. And again, I'm not saying that nominalizations are not important, but I think this overemphasis is at the expense of complex noun phrases. So complex noun phrases are groups of words around a noun, so which are quite long. So it can start with an article, adjective, noun, preposition, maybe two nouns, even longer. And academic writing is characterized by complex noun phrases. Advanced academic writing is. So again, we should be focusing more on complex noun phrases than nominalizations. And nominalizations may be some of those nouns in those complex noun phrases, but it's more about the complexity.